sustainability, ESG, the environment, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Depending on your politics and what kind of internal or external pressures your business is dealing with, you might either be leaning into these things or wondering if you should be avoiding them. But I have news for you. Despite the culture wars, Americans still care about sustainability. And today I'll tell you why, explain what your brand needs to know, and show you how your brand can connect with customers and actually grow with sustainable products and services. Hi, welcome to Insights to Activate, Ipsos' thought leadership series focusing on some of the biggest topics facing the world today. I'm Ben Meyerson, Director of Marketing and Communications here at Ipsos, and I'll be your host as we talk about ESG and how Americans are more on board with sustainability than the popular narrative would have you believe. It may take a bit of behavior change to get there, but brands have a role in that too. We have a group of amazing experts here today from Paramount, the Ad Council, and Ipsos who know all about meeting consumers where they are on sustainability and driving action. But first, let's take a moment to define what exactly we're talking about when we say sustainability and ESG. When some people say sustainability, they're only talking about the environment. But when we say sustainability here at Ipsos, we're talking about business decisions all across ESG. Let's zoom in on what that means. ESG is shorthand for business decisions that are beneficial to the environment, as well as things that improve society and foster a transparent, ethical way of governing or running your business. All these things contribute to running a business that is more sustainable long term. So the question is, do Americans care about this? The answer is still yes. By one measure, on the E, a clear majority of Americans feel that businesses need to act now to fight climate change, or they'll be failing their employees and customers. And while there's a reputation that people elsewhere in the world care more about climate change than Americans, the reality is that Americans are only 7 points behind the average of 33 countries around the world. And beyond caring, Americans are voting with their wallets on sustainability, and brands that take advantage are growing. Despite the fact that sustainable products make up less than 20% of the consumer packaged goods market, sustainable products make up 31% of CPG growth. That's a huge opportunity. So, how can brands take advantage? That's where our new framework comes in that we call the ABCs of ESG. It's all about asking questions related to how your business interacts with consumers that can help you drive behavioral change. Specifically, it's about bridging the say-do gap. That's the gap between what people say they're going to do on sustainability compared to what they actually do. First, how can you get people's attention with your sustainable initiatives? Second, what are people's beliefs about good sustainable behavior? And then third, how can you get compliance? How can you make sustainable purchases the default and bridge that say-do gap? Let's meet our panel and get into it.
Thank you for having me. My name is Elise James DeCruz, Chief Equity Officer at the Ad Council. I'm really excited about the role that we can all play to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging across the workforce, workplace, marketplace, and community. And looking forward to having a great conversation.
Hi, I'm Jesse Itzkowitz, and I'm Ipsos's Chief Behavioral Scientist. And so here at Ipsos, I lead a team of mostly recovering academics like myself, and our job is to reveal, measure, and influence the non-conscious factors that drive people's decisions.
It's a very cool title. I'm Jessica Thurston. My pronouns are she, her. I lead ESG and sustainability for Paramount Global, and we are home to brands such as CBS, Paramount Pictures, of course, halfway in the name, Nickelodeon, MTV, BET, and so many more. And so I'm responsible for our global strategy around ESG and how we manage and mitigate our environmental, social, and governance impacts. And really excited to talk more about this. We think a lot about the difference between consumers and customers in the world of Paramount Global. And I'm very interested in learning more about this research and how it might impact some decisions we're making. Really happy to be here.
My name is Claire Hanlon. I am the president and head of ESG for Ipsos US, and it's my responsibility to help us as an organization help clients like you make sure that we do a great job in ESG. I'm also responsible to help our teams say the right things, do the right things, and act in the right way. So happy to be here, excited for the conversation.
Thank you so much, Claire. Let's start with Jesse now. And as our chief behavioral scientist, you are behind this ABCs of ESG that we're talking about today. Can we dive a little bit more into that? First off, what a great name. But it's so catchy, which is why it's so much fun to get into that. So what can you tell us a little bit more about how it works and what you use it for?
Yeah, and it's a great question. And we know that ESG is a place where intention doesn't always lead to action. And that was really what spurred our thinking of, how do we help companies prepare their customers and consumers to actually make these changes present within their own life. And so we turn to a very basic model of how people process information and make decisions. And it's not dissimilar to how we market. First, we really need to make people aware of something and capture that attention so that way they can think about it. Afterwards, they form some beliefs and attitudes and feelings around what it is that's important, how it fits into their own lives, and what it is that they want to do to move forward. And then that compliance part is really the final part where we turn that thinking into action. And so whether it's those individual nudges that help us make the right decisions, maybe through some of the defaults that you mentioned before, or even thinking about how do we incentivize good behaviors and maybe even tax or stop some bad behaviors, there are some really nice ways that we can leverage that framework to really explore all of the different areas where people may have that gap. Is it that they're not paying attention to things? Is it that they have incorrect beliefs? Or is all of that present, but it's just too hard at that moment of action for them to actually do something?
Yeah. And you're asking questions as part of this framework, right? But you're also bringing in insights from other areas as you work to bridge that specific gap that folks might have to get to that action point, to get to the do from the say.
That's exactly right. And I think it's one of the coolest parts about integrating behavioral science into this work is not only does it tell us what to explore, but then we can leverage 50 to 60 years worth of validated academic research to say, this is how we drive attention. This is how we change beliefs. This is how we get people to act. And so it really provides a seamless way from our inquiry all the way through the actions that companies and brands should be taking.
So Jessica, as one of the world's biggest media companies, Paramount has a huge role in shaping the narrative around ESG. You also have great insight into what works and what doesn't. So how should media companies balance meeting people where they are with pushing them forward?
I appreciate this question so much, and I think about it in two ways. First, our responsibility, and second, our opportunity. And first, I believe we have an obligation to use our platforms to reflect what our audiences care about, but also to reflect important conversations that we know are happening. And from an ESG perspective, we talk about materiality so much, and I promise not to get too technical or in the weeds with any of this, but for us, we think about what goes into the box of content. Everything touching content, who created it, who wrote it, who directed it, who did the makeup for it, where is it going, to what audiences, what's the genre. All of that is material, and that's where we identify the questions for us about what are our environmental and social and governance risks and opportunities. So even in the creation of content, we have a responsibility to think about our environmental impact, but also how we embed DE&I and belonging and accessibility and inclusion across the board into our decision making. And that then translates to our opportunity, which is to take the reach that we have and think about how we embed new and challenging and multi-dimensional narratives into the content we create, while also really, really respecting the creative process. There is a separation of church and state there that's very important. And that also is different for us when we think about things like CBS News versus Paramount Pictures movies. It's a very different process where we still are, as a corporation, are secondary to the creatives driving this content. But where we have seen a lot of progress, and we have data that backs this up, is in embedding certain social impact topics into our content. We have content, for example, in certain countries where as a result of this content, and depending on what it was about, we've seen people know, for example, their HIV status rate at higher rates of knowledge after watching our content. Or we see here through our Content for Change initiative, which is a massive company-wide initiative we're doing to make data-driven decisions about understanding bias in content. So we are using that to then say, what are different DE&I topics we need to address? How do we, for example, challenge ideas about racism and move audiences to be anti-racist? How do we then measure that impact? That's an opportunity and even an obligation for us, and a really interesting direction media is going. And finally, where I am thinking a lot on my team about climate in content. We have this opportunity to think about how climate shows up, and it's not as simple as an inconvenient truth. Not that that was simple, but it's not just saying, oh, it's documentaries about climate change. There is passive versus active content, right? A flyover of a neighborhood and you see solar panels on the roofs, but they're not addressed. It just is sort of business as usual and operating as usual, versus really implicit or explicit content like a climate allegory, talking explicitly about climate change versus it just being kind of the reality in the background of a program. And so thinking through the different ways that these complex topics show up in our content is a huge focus of ours. And it's one where we are needing to think about meaningful data and how we actually track audience behavior. How do we track the impact that content has and understand that to then re-inform the creative process? It's a very exciting challenge.
That nugget about people knowing their HIV status at a higher rate after watching one of your programs, that's so fascinating to me. And again, you talked about measurement, but I mean, that is a concrete way in which your content has informed the world and made it a better place.
The folks that work on that content are operating on another level as far as I'm concerned. It's amazing, but it's a signal to us to continue partnerships with data organizations, with academic organizations, so that it's not just coming from us. We want these efforts to be industry-wide. A lot of this only happens through industry partnership, because these are challenges, even in getting the data about who's behind the camera, who's on screen. There are different diversity metrics. What's a consistent way of measuring and appropriately disclosing that is difficult without sort of sharing resources and then sharing the outcomes of that work.
I think this is a great segue into you, Elise, and what you do at the Ad Council. Now, so you all at the Ad Council have been working on ESG before it was cool, right? For decades and decades. At least before we started calling it ESG, right? So, how has your public service mission changed on ESG and those principles over time? And what do you think brands and companies can learn from your journey to make the world a better place?
Well, thank you so much for the question. The Ad Council has been in this business for 80 plus years, focusing on the most pressing issues and really some uncomfortable issues. And we're committed to ensuring that we continue to meet people where they are. Some of the issues have changed and have become more complex, and some of the issues haven't. But our approach is still the same. We want to ensure that we meet people where they are. We have a data-driven approach. We honor and respect the audiences that we are telling, that we're amplifying their stories, and that we partner with best-in-class organizations like yourselves who have deep expertise, who can support in our efforts to shed light on topics and societal issues that are important. To answer your follow-up question, it's really important to make sure that we recognize we can't do it alone. We really have to be thoughtful and intentional about obviously the messaging, also the partnerships, and to continue to give voices to the voiceless so that they can feel seen and heard and valued. and most important, celebrated. You know, we talked about, you know, Smokey the Bear. His 80th birthday is coming up in a little bit, and you know, we want to make sure that we can continue to promote and amplify our important issues, all the way from, you know, Smokey the Bear, all the way through to the Love Your Mind campaign, where we tackle mental health. And we want to continue to be a partner in shaping, you know, the lives and experiences, you know, throughout our nation.
Smokey the Bear is turning 80. He looks great, let me say.
He does look great.
But I mean, so over time, obviously, it's not been the same Smokey. He's had a couple of wardrobe changes. But how has the way that you've dealt with Smokey? I mean, a wonderful environmental activist. I mean, in all reality, how has the way that you've changed the way Smokey operates over the year? How has that shaped the way you do things with Smokey? How have you seen him be accepted in the world, and how have you changed the way Smokey sends his message?
Yeah, well, a lot of it has to do with data. You know, data, as we know, and storytelling, and to gain insights from our audiences about the campaign, how it's resonating, who it's resonating with. But it's really about listening to our audiences. We know that, you know, it's important for the environment, for sure, to be able to you know, prevent forest fires, and it's also important to make sure that we recognize where the audiences are, what you know, in what ways we need to get the messaging out. There are a lot of different ways to meet our audiences where they are across various social media platforms, so we want to make sure that we're current.
Yeah, and you talked, obviously your role is really more narrowly focused on DEI and belonging, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging at the Ad Council. So are there any campaigns that you see as your flagship, or you've talked about working inside and outside of the Ad Council with that kind of work?
Absolutely. I mean, we want to make sure that we are very intentional and pragmatic about how we address various issues across, whether it's diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, accessibility. And that's one of the reasons why when I joined a little over 3 years ago, we wanted to make sure that we were addressing, to your point, both internal and external root causes, right? So that's when we introduced workforce, workplace, marketplace, and community. So like workforce is looking at representation, workplace is looking at the culture, marketplace is the broader ecosystem, and then community is the community, right? How can we prepare the next generation of you know, professionals to see themselves in this work? And we spend a lot of time not only identifying the problem, but being really thoughtful about how we can operationalize it, right? Like where can we make the most impact? And that's very similar philosophy that we use to approach our outside work as well. You know, so we just want to make sure that we are not afraid to tackle the hard stuff and the hard issues. What I've recognized, not only doing this work, but you know, being a Black woman, you know, doing this work and out in the universe is, you know, you're I feel like when you have that kind of uncomfortableness, you know, the butterflies in your stomach, when you're tackling something really important, when you push through that, that's where the magic happens. You know, that's where the courage begins. I'm like getting goosebumps because every time, you know, when I talk to my kids about it too, it's like, don't be afraid to push through, because that's really where you're going to make that impact and connect with people on a human level, you know, to really get them brought in to whatever cause that you're trying to, you know, really focus on, or the problem that you're trying to solve.
I love that. And can I just comment for a second? Because I'm so impressed by some of the things that both of you said. I think first, you know, one of the things that you mentioned is focusing on the individual and society. And I think one of the real advances in behavioral science over the past 5 years is realizing even though we do things as individuals, it's sometimes not enough, right? We need to tackle it from more of a societal angle as well. And so even though we might have all of these individual nudges that change what we do, that all happens within the context of what our governments and the brands and our cultures are doing as well. And so it's so fantastic to hear how you're using data to both kind of understand that individual behavior of what's making them receptive toward certain messages, the medium in which they want to receive those messages in, but also thinking about how do we go broader than that? How do we engage in alliances with brands and companies to really make this happen societally? And Jessica, I loved, when you were talking as well, it's people, I think, sometimes shut off when they hear those explicit messages, right? And I think that, one of the things we know is if you put up a sign that says, "Don't throw rocks at me," it'll be dinged up with rocks that people have thrown at it. And so even hearing that, like, how are these implicit ways that we're showing what the norm should be, or calling attention to certain things, whether it's through representation that I might look at in the credits, whether they're opening or closing, seeing those solar panels in a flyover shot. I think these are the ways that we're thinking about it, because those beliefs we know are not easily changed, right? And so how do we make sure that we're sort of coupling that explicit message of what we know is important to learn and know, maybe from a factual basis, alongside all of these other subtle cues that can also promote the same kind of things?
Yeah. I mean, again, I find your world of studying this so fascinating, because I think a lot about how viewers, people absorbing content, and first of all, we do it all day long in so many different ways, not just film and television, but we have these implicit belief systems, and we have immediate reactions to things that are emotional and subconscious. And I am certainly not a creative person creating the content that we do. I sit in an office and I look at spreadsheets and I make compelling decks, I think, for leadership. But, thinking about how they actually change minds and behaviors through storytelling, and there is such a science to it, and yet it's such an art. And trying to, I'll say manipulate that is the wrong word, but trying to at least embed change management into that. We're so just at the beginning, and yet we're at this time at which we can't move slowly. We have to reflect these societal issues and challenges, but in very authentic ways, and in ways that are different for different audiences, for different genres. And everything moves so quickly that from my perspective, it's challenging to know, what do we actually study right now to continue to build this business case? Which audiences, do we even know who we're not reaching? Do we understand this audience from a behavior change standpoint, but not this one? And so I just think there's so much still to learn.
Claire, I'm going to throw to you now. As our head of ESG here, so let me hit you with a hard question. So brands and companies have so many competing priorities today, right? So why should they care about ESG amid the chaos of the modern world? So to put it more bluntly, I mean, what's in it for them?
Oh, it's such a good question. And, this conversation that we're having today just illustrates the power behind it and the enthusiasm. So there's functional things and there's emotional things that a company kind of gets from it. Certainly brand equity, organizational equity. People want to buy from companies and organizations that they like and admire. So that's a pretty broad statement, but very, very high increased brand equity is the first thing. I think the other thing is, two very impressive women here, the talent that you can attract at an organization that you have the same beliefs in. That's a big thing. So employee base, and people want to work for companies that they admire. Some other things is that, when you're focusing on the right things, and organizations are focusing on the right things within ESG, your stakeholders pay attention. So we've talked about your consumers, your customers, your employees, but let's not forget investors and lenders. Because if you're doing the right thing, then you're a safer investment, and there's reduced risk. And then obviously, if all these things go right, and it's a long journey, like Jessica talked about, it's, the journey will be long, but it's an important one. At the end of the day, healthy P&Ls, reduction in costs, increased margins and volumes, that kind of thing. So it's a laundry list of things that the benefits of focusing on ESG. Those are just some big ideas.
Jessica, you talked a bit about how you talk to investors. They not just on earnings calls, but you'll have discussions with them offline. I mean, how does that factor in when you talk to them? Does that ring true to you?
Beyond true. I mean, for us, ESG is very much a practice in risk mitigation. It is a lens by which we look at operational inefficiencies. And I always say, if we get a question from an investor group or from a partner of ours, suppliers want to know especially our DE&I data. Those are anything that is a question of our viability is a question that has some sort of ESG externality in it. And it means that maybe there's slop in the system that we can better address. Typically, it's actually probably something we have an answer for, but then need to communicate transparently externally. And so that is our guiding light in thinking about, we are a content production company first. You know, we make movies, TV, we work with advertising partners, we work with major suppliers across the board. That has to all come first. And ESG, everything we do in sustainability has to make business sense. And it does, because we're using it to say, hey, this is a huge opportunity to reduce our costs. Or when it comes to things like the energy used to produce a film, we think about the lights on a set. There are opportunities there to not only send a signal to the market that, hey, studios care about renewable energy or, you know, interest, yes, water consumption. It's a huge thing on set. Or they care about, you know, we're going to need more electric hookups for, you know, new ways of powering generators and trailers. It sends an important signal to the market, but it's also a way of us being prepared for the future and what comes over the next several years, for being able to say, in changing environments and where the energy grid is shifting and we have access to water in different ways. And, you know, we have production sets, by the way, all over the world. So we have to think about all these different permutations of impacts, and it is a resilience exercise for us more than anything.
You know, it's interesting that, Jessica, you just talked about all of the things that, you know, you're a production company and you've got a responsibility to your stakeholders to do exactly that. And so we talk a lot at Ipsos about how ESG has to be the co-benefit. So products need to work, they need to deliver, you need to give what you've promised, but ESG is kind of the bow and the blessing that's on top. Because when you feel good and you're coming up with new ways to find renewable energy, reduce water consumption, or recycle, or find the right staff that has the right diverse perspectives to bring innovation to the offer. Those are all things that matter, but it has to be on top of what you're the core offering that you're giving to the market. So yeah, ESG as a co-benefit is something we talk about a lot.
I like that.
All right, I think it's time we're going to go and take some questions from our audience now at this point. I think we've had a few come in. And so let's start here first with Jessica. And this is one real, I mean, with Paramount as such a big company with so many different offers, how do you balance ESG considerations when you have a wide range of viewers across the social and political spectrum?
I appreciate that. I'm going to put on my other hat, which is as a professor of ESG-aligned corporate governance. Don't all sign up at once. Exciting it sounds, but a strong ESG program is grounded in a strategy that is very specific to the impacts. And so the way I think about that for us is that there are impacts related to different brands of ours. For Nickelodeon, for example, we have a large consumer products business in which we license our IP. We're not direct manufacturers, adding another sort of layer of complexity and the need for engaging with our stakeholders and our suppliers very closely. But that brings one sort of group of environmental and social, particularly labor and the supply chain risks, that is quite different than, for example, CBS News, where some of the most material issues from an ESG perspective for us there are journalistic integrity and accuracy and managing disinformation, which is, of course, a political issue right now. and doing that in a way that we're demonstrating that, yes, this is part of a larger company, a global corporation, and yet the folks who manage the news process are experts in their field. And our responsibility is to make sure, when they're in dangerous situations reporting the news, do they have the right safety equipment? Are we ensuring that we have a feed that lasts? And in that way, are we supplying, do we have a good energy supply? How are we then transmitting data in a secure way and thinking about IP and copyright? Versus then Paramount Pictures, where we're thinking these are longer productions, there's more folks. We think about above and below the line folks behind the camera, meaning directors, showrunners, and folks doing makeup and hair, and how it's truly an ecosystem that exists just for that one film for that period of time. And there can be unique ESG issues, but also pervasive ones that we continue to, that we think about no matter what, such as water use, energy use, but more importantly, diversity on screen, as well as are people safe and protected on set, and are they rigged up correctly? I don't know, I don't go on a lot of sets and I'd like to, but that all of these different sort of permutations of risk and opportunity together create this picture of how we manage ESG strategically. And it can be, we also have to be cognizant of the fact that, yes, we talk a lot about embedding diverse content, climate-focused content, and at the same time, we're an entertainment company, and we do have programs that are not at all about educating people necessarily, and that's okay too, because that is our business. That's how we're still reaching consumers of our content. It doesn't mean our obligation and responsibility stops. It just means that certainly compliance with regulatory requirements and industry standards is paramount, pun intended. But it's really, what is everything underneath that? What is sort of the scaffolding holding up our productions, our content, our relationships with advertisers and distributors? That's where ESG comes in. And as long as we are focusing on what the business is, and I just love this idea that ESG is a co-benefit, because it's a bow and a benefit. I really love that. It's exactly right. It's a way that we send the signal that we are taking our impacts seriously, and that we're thinking about our place in the world as a company, but also what is influencing us as a company and what we are influencing. And as long as we continue to communicate that transparently and appropriately, and taking feedback on how we need to change, that's really all we can do. And it keeps me on my toes, and no day is the same, that I'll hear something going on at Nickelodeon or at MTV, and then something beyond totally different over at CBS Sports, because we're thinking about things like how we reduced emissions and costs at the Super Bowl this year and our energy consumption, and also got to slime people and show it on Nickelodeon. Like, it's pretty wild. Yeah.
Has the slime formula become more sustainable?
You know what? It's on my list. I'm going to say it's lower on the list, but still very important. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I hadn't thought about the fact that because you license toys for Nickelodeon, I mean, you play in that, would you call it consumer packaged goods? I mean, it's a packaged good. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, and we do have a direct-to-consumer. We have ParamountShop.com. We do have a direct-to-consumer business, but it's still that we have licensed our IP to all of these partners around the world that are actually manufacturing it. Yeah. And there are, aside from greenwashing regulations, things that we of course keep an eye on and are responsible around, but there's different consumer expectations of us, more so now than ever, around, are we clear on what the standards are for our own products? If you have a SpongeBob toy, folks want to know how it got there. And we take that really seriously, especially around SpongeBob's 25th anniversary happening right now.
Yes.
I know.
So many anniversaries.
Yeah. He's a grown-up sponge.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are Smokey the Bear shirts too, right? There are the Smokey the Bear merchandise T-shirts. Maybe they're black market. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Yes. But yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting how many different spaces we all play in this space. Yeah. All right, let's take another question now. So Elise, this one for you, I would say, it's again a little more blunt. I mean, DEI seems like it's been getting the brunt of the energy in the culture wars lately. Has that changed your strategy?
Not at all. Not at all. You know, this is a perfect moment in time where you can stand on your convictions about why this work is so important. And yes, there are a lot of things being said about what acronym we should use. But my philosophy is do the work. Let's spend just as much time or more time on doing the work and holding space for people to tell their story, extending grace as you're walking through this journey. That as you do with trying to figure out if there should be a DEIB, DEIBA, take out the E, it's just, it's at a point now where it's, it can be exhausting. I do think there are a lot of DEI practitioners and leaders and organizations more broadly who are truly committed to the work that are exhausted. At the same time, it's a lot of there's a lot of sparks and fire, if you will, that's truly propelling people to be just unapologetic about this work and what needs to happen so that all people can feel seen and heard and valued and respected, and also recognizing that a lot of these societal issues are systemic. And, we didn't get here overnight, and we're not going to fix the problem overnight either. However, it does take a level of commitment, humility, and I think we talked earlier about, empathy and strategy to be able to, really advance this work in a really thoughtful and intentional way, both inside and outside of the organization. So, for me and in our organization, we're steadfast in our commitment to advancing this work in a really thoughtful and intentional way. And outside of that, it's really just noise. If you're going to do the work and your organization has, been truly invested in the work, you're going to continue to do what's required to ensure that you're showing up, for your people within the organization, as well as for yourself.
Jesse, I'm going to throw it back to you now. So you are our chief behavioral scientist, and so you work in areas besides ESG. So how does it getting someone to change their behavior in relation to the environment compare to, say, getting them to buy a different kind of cereal?
No, it's great, and I always feel like the luckiest person because I get to work across all of our verticals, whether it's media or finance, CPG, retail, and healthcare. And in some ways, maybe scary ways, they're not that dissimilar from one another. If we're launching an advertisement, we need to get people to pay attention to it. We need to tell them why our product is better, and we need them to take that product and type it into their Amazon cart or in their Google search bar. If it's a package, we need to do the same thing, like break through the clutter on the shelf, get them to think that we're right for them and move it into their carts. I think that the biggest difference when we think about ESG, and I think you reflected on this well, is it's often a reflection of the values that we have, right? When we call it justice, when we say that this is important to me, this is what we should be doing. And I think, the difference here is it induces a little bit of fear. And that's something that, we've definitely heard. And I love what both of you said, because one of the things that any company can do is turn the mirror on themselves first, right? What is the things that my company are paying attention to? What are the things that I want to do? What are the internal beliefs that I want to change? And then how do I do that? How do I create incentive structures within my organization to make those happen? When you turn the lens outward, though, we start to need to think about how people are going to respond to those actions. And I loved what you said about connection, right? As humans, we're social people. We all have this need for belonging and connection that is inherent, whether you're red, blue, or purple, right? That's something that we all feel. And I think that the issues that ESG touches upon are also values that almost all Americans have. Who doesn't want more opportunities for their children? Whether you're a hunter or a hippie, we all want a clean environment, right? And so I think it's a place where we can look at those values. Now, where it comes to the rubber meeting the road, I think that's where we've seen some of the missteps that companies have taken, right? And this is, again, a place where behavioral science can be really influential in how do we make sure that we're presenting these messages in a way that isn't offensive. So one of my good friends, Kate Lamberton, she's a professor at the Wharton School of Business, and she actually looked at like, how do we predict consumer offense? And it's probably not that surprising, right? People are offended by certain symbols, right? So to some people, it might be a Confederate flag. To others, it might be a pride flag, right? Or that language that we're using. Those are obvious no-nos that as corporations we know to avoid. I think the second ones are those relationships that we have. What seems fair for the companies that I'm engaging with for the sorts of things that they're asking me to do or to buy into? And then the final part is just how do you treat people with dignity? How do you not make them feel like the outsider in any of those situations, even when social trends are clearly moving into a different direction? And I think that's a place where, you know, we can start to think about how do we do this in an inclusive way that really makes everybody along with the journey. Maybe sometimes it's taking a level up from some of those identities that we have as a Jewish person or a man or even a New Yorker, right? I can eat Chicago pizza too. I'm a pizza lover. And so thinking about ways that you create those connections through the things that we're talking about and really leaning into those core values that we all have, I think is a really nice way to make that change, but very, very different. You know, I don't think anybody is going to stop eating Cheerios, you know, just because their next door neighbor is a Frosted Flakes fan.
You never know.
You never know.
Some rivalries go very deep. Yeah. Oh, wonderful. All right, I think we have time for one more question here, and let's end with Claire here to wrap it all up. So, Ipsos is a global company. What's the difference in getting people to pay attention to ESG in the U.S. compared to in Europe or South America?
That's a good one. It's a very good question. I think, you know, some of the data that you presented early, Ben, would suggest that it's almost just as important to Americans as it is to people around the world. Maybe 7% left, I think you said, if I remember. So our people, our citizens care. I think that the trouble starts because it's a difficult transition. It's a seismic change for many organizations, and I think almost 80% of chief sustainability officers say that the business of ESG, the transition to succeeding in sustainability, impacts their business wildly. So it's hard. And so when we've talked about being courageous, acknowledging the small steps, I mean, we love the end of the rainbow, but every journey is built on one step. So it's really important to fail fast and change, celebrate the wins, bring people along with us. So one of the things that's important is what collaborations can we have? What coalitions can we be part of or develop to be able to amplify the work that we're doing together so that we're all succeeding together, learning from one another, having these kinds of conversations. And I think, you know, the other piece is that, you know, the government has a role to play too, you know, for lots of companies, whether it be guidance and regulation or it be financial incentives like grants. These are important things for us, for companies to be able to kind of slingshot past the start line is the support that they'd get from the government. So it's a complicated question. I think we're on the right journey. It just might be a little slower than other countries at this point, but we'll get there. We'll get there.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. What a fantastic discussion. I really enjoyed speaking with each of you today, and I really am looking forward to staying in touch and learning more about what you do in the near future and the far future. And thank you all for joining us. If you haven't yet, you really should read our companion report on the ABCs of ESG, which gives lots of great data illustrating why this all matters to Americans and lays out solutions you can use at your company. We have one more piece of the Insights to Activate ESG campaign coming, a client impact story talking about how Ipsos has worked with Paramount to help make advertising more inclusive. And join us after that for our next topic, Global Trends, our flagship annual report surveying 50 markets in every continent around the world, taking the pulse of humanity so you can understand society, markets, and people.